The tension did not erupt out of nowhere. It built quietly, layered beneath weeks of speculation, misinterpretation, and mounting pressure that refused to dissipate. When Amelia Warner finally responded, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. What had once been dismissed as harmless gossip suddenly felt like a confrontation. For years, Amelia has been known for restraint rather than reaction. She rarely addresses rumors, choosing silence as a form of protection rather than avoidance. That history is precisely why her response carried such weight. When someone who never speaks decides to do so, people listen differently. The spark that ignited the clash was deceptively small. A comment, a gesture, or a moment interpreted too freely by online observers began circulating without context. As it spread, the narrative hardened, pulling Dakota Johnson into the center of a story she had not directly addressed. What followed was a collision of assumptions rather than confirmed facts. Amelia's reaction was not loud, but it was firm. Rather than naming names, she emphasized boundaries, respect, and the cost of speculation on real families. The wording was careful, yet unmistakably pointed. It read less like an attack and more like a refusal to tolerate further intrusion. The public reaction was instantaneous. Supporters praised Amelia for defending her space, framing the response as long overdue. Others questioned whether the message escalated a situation that might have faded on its own. Within hours, the narrative fractured into opposing interpretations. What made the moment volatile was its timing. The three names involved had already been linked repeatedly in recent headlines, creating a pressure cooker of expectation. Every silence was read as confirmation, every glance as provocation. Amelia's response broke that pattern by confronting the noise directly. Observers noted how deliberate the message felt. There was no emotional spillover, no loss of composure. Instead, it carried the tone of someone drawing a line after too many small crossings. That composure, paradoxically, made the response feel more severe. As the message circulated, older clips and articles resurfaced, stitched together to support competing narratives. Context collapsed under the speed of sharing. What had begun as a defense quickly became framed as a feud. In the ecosystem of online gossip, nuance rarely survives. Fans of Dakota pushed back, arguing that interpretation had replaced intent. They pointed out the absence of direct statements and cautioned against inflating indirect gestures into conflict. This back and forth only intensified attention, pulling more eyes toward a story built on inference. What complicated matters further was the silence from the third figure at the center of it all. Jamie Dornan had not responded publicly, allowing speculation to spiral unchecked. His absence from the conversation became its own provocation. When someone stands between two sides and says nothing, people project meaning onto the silence. Industry insiders suggested that Amelia's response was less about Dakota personally and more about reclaiming narrative control. Years of restraint can make even a measured response appear explosive. In that sense, the clash was not sudden, but cumulative. Pressure does not need volume to build. What stood out was how quickly the focus shifted from facts to emotion. The discussion moved away from what actually happened toward how people felt about it. Loyalty, protectiveness, and suspicion replaced clarity. The story became a mirror for audience bias rather than an account of events. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had changed. What was once gossip now carried the tone of confrontation. The phrase, "fierce clash," began appearing not because of raised voices, but because boundaries had been asserted. Conflict does not always arrive shouting. The real escalation, however, was still unfolding. Amelia had drawn a line, and Dakota had been placed on the opposite side of it by public perception. That left Jamie positioned squarely in the middle, whether he wanted to be or not. The stage was set for a response that could not remain restrained forever. As speculation intensified, one truth became unavoidable. Silence had failed to contain the narrative. Amelia's response marked the moment when private patience gave way to public defense. And once that threshold is crossed, the situation rarely de-escalates on its own. The breaking point came not from a single headline, but from accumulation. As the narrative continued to spiral, Those close to Jamie Dornan describe a growing sense that silence was no longer neutral. What once felt like dignity began to feel like surrender. When speculation starts dictating reality, restraint can become its own form of provocation. Jamie's reaction, when it finally surfaced, was described as unusually forceful. Not chaotic, not reckless, but unmistakably firm. He had spent weeks watching fragments of private life repackaged as conflict, boundaries reframed as hostility, and assumptions presented as fact. At a certain point, the cost of staying quiet outweighed the risk of responding. Sources say the frustration did not stem from jealousy or rivalry, but from intrusion. Jamie is known for guarding his family life with near-obsessive care. When that boundary is crossed repeatedly, patience erodes. The moment was less about choosing sides and more about ending a cycle he felt had gone too far. Behind the scenes, his response was directed inward before it ever touched the public sphere. Conversations were held, lines were clarified, and limits were set. What observers interpreted as an explosion was, in reality, the release of pressure built through restraint. Anger, when delayed long enough, often appears sudden to those who missed its buildup. The dynamic between Amelia Warner and Dakota Johnson was never as direct as headlines suggested. Amelia's defense had been about protecting family space, not attacking another individual. Jamie's reaction clarified that distinction, pushing back against the idea of a personal feud. The narrative had simplified something far more complex. Media outlets, however, thrived on escalation. Once the word explodes entered circulation, nuance vanished. A boundary-setting moment was reframed as volatility, and firmness was mistaken for loss of control. In celebrity culture, strong reactions are rarely granted context. Fans reacted sharply, dividing along familiar lines. Some praised Jamie for stepping in decisively, viewing the move as overdue protection. Others worried the response would only fuel further speculation. Both sides agreed on one thing: the silence that once kept the peace was no longer viable. What became clear is how little room exists for neutrality when multiple narratives collide. Jamie found himself cast as both shield and spark, depending on perspective. The role was not one he sought, but one imposed by circumstance. When private people become public symbols, control is often the first casualty. Industry voices later noted how rare it is for someone with Jamie's reputation for discretion to intervene at all. That rarity gave the reaction additional weight. It signaled that the situation had crossed an internal threshold, one invisible to outsiders but decisive nonetheless. When boundaries are breached repeatedly, response becomes inevitable. The aftermath revealed the cost of prolonged restraint. While the immediate noise intensified, the underlying message landed clearly with those involved. Lines had been drawn, expectations reset, and access narrowed. The reaction was not meant to entertain, it was meant to conclude. Interestingly, the response did not invite further explanation. There were no interviews, no clarifying statements, no attempts to reshape public opinion. Once the boundary was asserted, Jamie withdrew again. That withdrawal suggested the goal was containment, not engagement. Over time, attention began to drift. Without new fuel, the narrative lost momentum. The supposed clash faded as quickly as it had ignited, leaving behind questions about how it ever escalated so far. What remained was a reminder of how quickly speculation can outpace reality. At its core, this episode was less about conflict and more about limits. Amelia's defense, Jamie's reaction, and Dakota's silence were all responses to the same pressure from different angles. None were designed to perform, all were designed to protect. That common motive was lost in translation. The broader lesson is uncomfortable but familiar. In an environment that rewards amplification, silence is not always safety, and reaction is not always aggression. Sometimes, an explosion is simply the sound of a boundary being enforced. And once enforced, it rarely needs repeating. As the dust settles, what lingers is not scandal, but clarity. The clash did not reveal rivalry, it revealed fatigue. It exposed the cost of turning private lives into public narratives without consent. And in that exposure, The limits of speculation became briefly, unmistakably visible.